All right, we have to back up a little bit before we can talk about the Episcopal Church, to talk about the Church of England in the colonies. We start with the first Englishman to set foot, at least as a settlement, in Roanoke in 1585. First parish then in Jamestown in 1607. And then the Church of England established its first colonies in this list. And tell me, do you see anything, what do you see about this list? Where's Pennsylvania? That's a good question. Why do you think Pennsylvania is not part of it, not on that list?
It's not on the seaboard.
Well, that's true.
That's William Penn founded it.
William Penn, what was he? Quaker. He was a Quaker. So that's one of the reasons Pennsylvania isn't on the list. What else do you see that is kind of unique about this list? Well, perhaps the way the land was acquired. Except for New York, these are all southern colonies. And then why would that be? Well, who came to the northern colonies?
Puritans.
The Puritans, actually the separatists, who wanted to separate from the Church of England. So the northern colonies were settled first by people seeking freedom away from the Church of England. So you get this Puritan work ethic. In contrast, the southern colonies were started primarily by people seeking their fortune, people wanting to have a better living, and you see what you don't see in the north, you see in the south, this replanting of English aristocracy in the form of plantations and planters. So a big difference in what was happening in the northern colonies versus what was happening in the southern colonies. So the English church found a much better home, particularly in Virginia. Virginia is sort of the center where everything grew out of, starting with Jamestown. All the colonies were considered a missionary endeavor by the Church of England. So there were no actual parishes. There were certainly no bishops. So as the missionaries, England started to have a series of societies. One of them that we're most familiar with because it happens here in Pennsylvania is the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, the SPG. And we'll hear more about that in a few minutes. So there were no bishops. All the way up to the Revolution, there were no bishops. Because the commerce and the business aspects of the colonies mainly worked through London, the Bishop of London colony, and it wasn't really a formal arrangement, but just by the way things turned out, the Bishop of London had jurisdiction over the colonies. And the colonies, especially Virginia, asked for a bishop. They asked to have a formal diocese set up in the colonies. Church refused. But they already had a system where in the large diocese, the bishop couldn't necessarily cover it adequately, so they would set up a commissary somewhere in a remote, sort of like a field office for the bishop. And that's what they decided to do here. They set up commissaries, first in Virginia, and then in 4 or 5 other colonies as well. And that worked pretty well up to the point where there were serious disagreements. because the commissaries really didn't have the authority to tell a parish they could or couldn't do something that they really wanted to do. So the parishes were pretty independent. Toward the middle of the 18th century, we have what's called the Great Awakening. And it was started in large part by George Whitefield, who was an Anglican priest. Now, Anglican priests, once they completed their seminary training, would traditionally go to a parish and remain in that parish, maybe not forever, but that was what you did as an Anglican priest. George Whitefield had a different idea. He says, I don't want a parish. I want to be an itinerant preacher. And that's what he did. He went all around preaching. He was a very powerful preacher. He didn't shy away from controversial topics, like many others. He was kind of a strange guy. He was short, maybe 5'2". He was cross-eyed. He preached somewhere around 8,000 sermons. It's estimated he preached to over 1 million people. And he created this huge change. And being an Anglican, he had a strong influence by Calvin. So his preaching style and what he had to say was very attractive to Presbyterians, to Puritans, to people that were what we might call low church. By 1765, this Great Awakening actually came to the Anglican churches, starting in Philadelphia. In fact, Whitefield and Ben Franklin had a very long friendship, which is kind of interesting when you consider Ben Franklin was not a very religious kind of guy. So the Great Awakening spread through these middle states, and before that, the New Englanders were Congregationalists, Southerners were Anglican, you had Presbyterians and other denominations in the middle states, and that was pretty much the way it was. After the Great Awakening, the Anglicans were able to move further into the north. The other denominations would move into the south, so it was a much more homogeneous kind of a thing, and it's hard to underestimate the effect of the Great Awakening. It affected the theology, the preaching style, an emphasis on adult conversion, membership institutions changed, architectures of the church changed, the way the church was arranged inside as well, even the music. So the Great Awakening was a major event, and it changed many things, and we still, even today, feel the effects of it. About the same time, John Wesley, he also was in the same mode of being a missionary. He came to Georgia to do missionary work with the Indians, and on his way over, he met up with some Moravians that were on the same trip, and you probably already know, but the Moravians were a Protestant denomination that predated Luther. They're the oldest Protestant denomination. And that really had an effect on Wesley. And his adventure in Georgia was not all that successful, so he went back to England. And while he was in Georgia, his brother Charles started in Oxford this thing called the Holy Club. And what they were dealing with was the Church of England was kind of in a low energy place. They were going through the motions, they were doing everything they were supposed to do. but there wasn't a lot of energy in it. And that bothered people like Whitefield and people like the Wesleys. And they, in this group in Oxford, wanted to bring more life, more energy, more spirituality into the church. And they got the name the Holy Club. That was not supposed to be a flattering name, because they were doing holy stuff. So John Wesley, like George Whitefield, would go around, and Wesley was interested in, what about the people that work in the mines? What about the people that work in the ironworks? What about the people that the Church of England was not paying a whole lot of attention to? And rather than set up his own church, which is not what he wanted to do, he wanted to expand what the Anglican Church was doing, he set up societies. And the societies would, well, he was a lot like Paul. He would set up the society and put someone in charge of it, then he would go and set up another one. And eventually came to America and did the same thing. And by the 1770s, it was one of the, it wasn't a denomination itself, but it was one of the largest groups, all tied in with this Great Awakening event. So the church in the north, church in the south, had pretty much, they were the only game in town, or the first game in town anyway. But in the north, they were in competition. So it was much more difficult for the Church of England to attract people in the north than it was in the south. Thomas Barton was one of the missionaries for the SBG. Thomas Barton, we're probably more familiar with because he came to deal with the frontier, places like Carlisle and Huntington and Shippensburg and Gettysburg. And he also wanted to be a missionary to the Native Americans, to the Indians. And as we probably also know, he came here to St. James. He was the rector at St. James when the Revolutionary War started. So we get to that period of time, the eve of the Revolution. There's about 400 independent congregations throughout the colonies. Start of the Revolution, we have a situation that is almost like it was under Henry VIII, where the clergy had pledged allegiance not to the Pope, but to the King. And we're fighting a revolution to get away from the King. So that puts the Anglican clergy in a rather difficult position. They either have to violate their oath, or they have to stop doing what they're doing. In the case of Thomas Barton, on July 4th, 1776, Thomas Barton was put under house arrest, and St. James Church was boarded up and locked, and it stayed that way for the whole 6 years of the Revolution. Other denominations didn't have this problem. They could go on. Remember, there was no separation of church and state in the Church of England. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution. It actually ended in Yorktown in 1781, but it took them 2 years to get the treaty drafted and approved. So as early as 1780, the term Protestant Episcopal Church comes into use. 1785, we have the first General Convention held in Philadelphia, where they put together a constitution for the church, not our national constitution. And they revised the prayer book. Naturally, references, prayers for the king were removed and replaced with prayers for the nation. The first 9 dioceses were established. And if you look at the little crosses on our shield, and the shield is the symbol for the Episcopal Church in the United States. Those 9 crosslets correspond to the first 9 dioceses. So how do you put this church together? You have the Church of the South, which is quite different from the Church of the North. And then you have these Methodists that are doing something that is also a little bit different. And it's this time when the Methodist societies become a separate denomination. And one of the reasons, as I said earlier, what Wesley would do was put a lay person in charge of the society. So the Methodists were not really tied into apostolic succession the way the Anglicans were. So that being, and if you remember the last time, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Chicago-Lambeth quadrilateral, and one of the 4 basic tenets was apostolic succession. So their need to see that that's not necessary for them, that, and probably other things as well, caused the separation of the Methodists into a separate denomination away from the Episcopal Church. New England and the North were able, more or less, to resolve their differences. Not completely, but pretty much. While this is happening, the rest of the country, or the rest of the colonies, states now, are trying to figure out how do we formulate a national government. And a lot of the conclusions that they came to paralleled the way the Episcopal Church was set up, and we'll see that shortly. We had the clergy problem, because most of the clergy, most of the Anglican clergy disappeared. So we had very few priests, we had no bishops, we had no seminaries. Samuel Seabury was the first to be elected bishop in Connecticut. And he went to England to be consecrated. And guess what the folks in England did in 1783? They said, we're not going to consecrate a bishop in an American Episcopal Church. So what did he do? The next year, he went to Scotland. And the Scots were more than happy to poke their finger in the eye of the English church and consecrate Samuel Seabury as the first bishop, first Anglican bishop outside the British Isles. So now we had a bishop, and we were able to ordain priests. But we didn't have any seminaries, so the priests still had to come from England. It wasn't until 1817 that we had General Seminary in New York City, first Episcopal Seminary. One of the things that the commissaries did, the commissary in Virginia started the William and Mary College, but that was not a seminary. So then we have subsequent seminaries being started in 1824, 54, and 57. Right now we have 9 seminaries in the United States. So now we have one bishop. How many bishops does it take to consecrate another bishop? Three, right? So we're still not quite there. William White was elected bishop in Pennsylvania, and Samuel Provost in New York. And by 1787, the Church of England said, well, maybe it's okay if we consecrate bishops, since it's already happened. And the wounds had healed a little bit from the Revolution. So William White and Samuel Provost were consecrated bishops. So now we have 3 American bishops. We can consecrate other bishops in the United States. So now we are pretty much independent. So, next question, should there be archbishops? There's Archbishop of Canterbury and there's an Archbishop of York. Should there be an Archbishop of the United States? And the answer was no. We will not have archbishops. Instead, we will have a presiding bishop. And what's the job of the presiding bishop at this point? It is simply to preside at the General Convention, which happens every 3 years. So in the first years, William White was the first presiding bishop, followed by, guess who? Samuel Seabury and Provost. Then they decided, once those 3 were finished, that the way to have a presiding bishop should be the one with the most seniority. So if you've been bishop longer than anybody else, when the current presiding bishop died or retired, generally died, the one with the most seniority. It wasn't until 1926 that the presiding bishops were actually elected at General Convention. In General Convention, the governing bodies were the House of Deputies, which was made up of lay and clergy, and then a little bit later on, they created the House of Bishops. So you can see that there's this parallel between the way our federal government is arranged and the way the Episcopal Church was arranged. House of Bishops being similar to the Senate, the House of Deputies being similar to the House of Representatives. There was a second great awakening in mid-19th century. But along with that was, again, in Oxford. And this same melees, you could call it, that was going on still in the Church of England, took a turn in a different direction. John Keble started preaching sermons that leaned us, again, not towards a low church, but towards a higher church. There were some that even wanted to reconnect, rejoin with the Roman Catholic Church. So this was a return to high church. And remember that the church at this point, especially at the parish level, was very Protestant. It was very plain. There were no vestments, there were no candles, there were no statues, there were no stained glass windows. All of that stuff had disappeared, and it's the Oxford movement that brought a lot of that back and moved the church, at least part of the church, in a high church direction, and that also began to spread to the United States. So, high church held high. The apostolic succession, they were wary of civil government. You have this dichotomy of part of, and this is England, part of the government that was what we call high church, was leery of the parliament, which was populated primarily by what used to be Puritans, but now the Protestant. So it was going back to the Magna Carta, going back to the Divine Right of Kings, saying how much authority should be in this upper house, House of Lords, and how much authority should be in the lower house. And the upper house was very leery of the lower house. And that's what we're talking about, is wariness of civil government, because the upper house figured they really knew better than these lower house people, and not so sure about them. Evangelicals, adult renewal, and this is the other side of the coin. So you have this high church, low church thing. Again, going back, Absalom Jones. You know about Absalom Jones?
Yeah.
Interesting guy. And we did a pilgrimage, a little mini pilgrimage last year to St. Thomas Church in Philadelphia, which Absalom Jones started, and is a black Episcopal church. But he was born a slave in Delaware, so it's not a slavery like in the Deep South, but a slave nevertheless, in Delaware, and he was sold to a merchant in Philadelphia. And he was able to earn enough money to buy his freedom. But before he did that, he bought the freedom for his wife so that his children would be born free. Because if his wife had remained in slavery, then the children would automatically be slaves as well. So he got his wife free, he got himself free, and started the St. Thomas African Episcopal Church in Philadelphia. He was ordained a deacon in '95 and the first black African American priest in 1804. And that sort of sets the stage for what the church was doing in the mid-19th century when we get to the Civil War. As we can imagine, there were hostile political debates around what is the church going to do? Is the church going to support slavery, as it would want to do in the South? Remember, still Virginia is a big center for the Episcopal Church. Or does the church want to resist slavery for all the reasons that we would easily recognize nowadays? Wasn't such an easy question to answer. The church ended up taking no position. They were not pro-slavery, they were not anti-slavery. So when General Convention met during the Civil War, the seats for the Southern dioceses were there just the same, except the Southern Church seceded with their states. And remember that allegiance to the state trumped allegiance to the country at that period. So when the states seceded, the churches seceded with them. The church basically ignored that, and General Convention went on as they usually did, with the southern seats empty. And it's this same time, from 65 to 70, that thousands of African Americans left the church to start their own denominations. We move up to the new century. And this is where it's now not anti-slavery, pro-slavery kind of division, but a three-way division. We have the conservative end, idealized divine right to accumulate wealth, the sacredness of private property, and the virtue of unfettered competition. And we know what that group was. It would be the so-called robber barons, and that part. And then there was a middle group, the institutional church, rise of the church groups aimed to help and assist other communities. And then we had a progressive end that said, in opposition to the first one, they had a vision of ultimate transformation of the whole American society. So how was the church organized? Well, there's the national church with the presiding bishop in charge. The national church does general convention and the Book of Common Prayer. They also do the canons, the national canons, which are the rules for the whole church. Then there are provinces, geographical collection of provinces. There's 9 provinces. We're Province 3, and Province 3 includes Virginia, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. Inside the provinces are dioceses. Each diocese has a bishop and a standing committee, and each diocese does an annual diocesan convention, which we just last week elected delegates to. And the delegates at diocesan convention will elect delegates to go to general convention. Inside dioceses, we have convocations, a geographical collection of parishes. Our convocation is the Convocation of Lancaster, the 10 Episcopal churches in Lancaster County. And inside the convocations, of course, are parishes with a rector or other clergy, a vestry, and an annual meeting. And you can see how this layered hierarchy from national church down to parishes and even to mission churches, which are under the direction of the bishop. But you also see how it's democratic in that the governing bodies from vestry to standing committee of the diocese, all the way up to general convention and the national church, are all elected by the people. So the church has experienced exponential growth during the post-war period. That has unfortunately reversed from the 80s on. And we started to get more involved in social justice issues. In 1963, the House of Bishops officially endorsed civil rights legislation. And it's not as though that was the first time we were involved in social issues. 19th century, post-Civil War, very much involved in social issues. And one of the big changes, 1979, was the new Book of Common Prayer, which we will go into in a later session. Women's ordination, July 29th, 1974. The Philadelphia 11, known as, were ordained. The canons did not allow the ordination of women at the time. There was a growing groundswell, I guess you'd say, for the ordination of women. Retired priests were allowed to ordain, and it was a retired priest that ordained these contrary to what the canons allowed. And then the next year in Washington, 4 more women were ordained as priests. So the handwriting is kind of on the wall. 1976, The General Convention approved the ordination of women. 1977, the first women were canonically ordained to the priesthood. In 1989, we have Barbara Harris consecrated the first female bishop in the whole Anglican Communion. She was the bishop in Massachusetts. 2006, we have Catherine Jefferts Schori elected as the first female primate as presiding bishop. And then we come to the sexual identity issues, and Gene Robinson, who was elected bishop in New Hampshire in 2003, and confirmed by the subsequent General Convention. Created quite a stir, to say the least. As far as the Anglican Communion is concerned, the Episcopal Church was sort of put on a timeout. One of the things that the Bishop of Canterbury has, I think it's every 10 years, is a meeting of all the primates from the different Anglican churches around the world, which was pretty much the churches that once a colonialism of places like India and New Zealand and Australia, Canada, developed their own Episcopal church, or not Episcopal, but their own Anglican church with their own prayer book. And the Bishop of Canterbury brings them together on usually a day. We were barred from the meeting until we get this resolved. So 2012, a rite of blessing for same-sex union was adopted, and in 2015, a rite of marriage was extended to all persons, regardless of gender, but not yet included. So there is yet no approved liturgy for same-sex marriage in the prayer book. Bookending with Absalom Jones, we have Michael Curry, ordained as priest, consecrated as bishop in North Carolina, and elected as presiding bishop in the last General Convention, well, the one before, 2015. The next General Convention, which, by the way, is going to be in Baltimore, pretty local. If you have a chance, it would be great. There'll be thousands of Episcopalians coming to Baltimore. You don't have to be a delegate, but it'll be a great thing to participate in, or to see, or to visit. So that is a real thumbnail sketch of the development of the Episcopal Church from its Anglican roots in colonial times up until almost now.